Out of the box, Laravel is configured for you to be productive immediately without thinking about much. In this snippet, we're going to take things a step further and I'm going to show you 4 things that I tend to add to every single project I create. These are pretty opinionated, so I'm not saying you have to include them, but in my opinion, if you do add them to your projects, you're going to end up with a much better developer experience while working with Laravel. So let's jump straight in with the first one, which is probably the most controversial, and that is setting up unguarded models. Now, to demonstrate this, you might not know how this works. I've created a fresh Laravel project here, and all I have is a post model and a user model, and you can see that these are related to each other. Now, this post model by default, when we create it, it's going to look something like the following. So there isn't really much in here. Now, you've probably come across this if you've worked with Laravel for any length of time. Let's just go over to our web roots and let's go ahead and create out a new post. So to do this, we're going to obviously reference the post model and we're going to say create. And at the moment, I just have a title in here. So I'm going to say post 1. Now, you can probably guess if you've worked with Laravel before what is going to happen here. Let's head over to the browser and give this a refresh. And we get the add column to fillable property to allow mass assignment on, and then the name of the model. Now, this is pretty standard because by default, we are guarding all of the properties of a model so they can't be accidentally filled when we are taking user input and creating a model. What we would normally do in our code, of course, we wouldn't do this and actually create this with hard-coded content. We would take in the request data. So we would have a request coming in here. Then we would go ahead and validate this. So we would say something like request and validate. And let's just pull this in. So we get our type hints here. This will come from Illuminate HTTP and request. And then we would just pass in all the validation rules. So for example, a title here, we might say required, etc. Now, when we do go ahead and do this, what we're going to get back is the validated data. So we would typically just name this variable data, and then we would create this with the data that we've validated. So we would just specify the data we wanted to put into a model. An alternative way of doing this is validating as normal, but then going ahead and saying request only, and then just choosing the columns you want to fill in. And this is either an array or a single or multiple arguments. Now, the reason that we have guarded models is that, for example, we could do something like this, request all. Now, this is a really, really bad approach, and mass assignment is there to protect us against us doing something like this. So it is a kind of sensible default, but once you've worked with Laravel for a while and you're pretty sure you're always validating and only passing in the columns that you want to fill, you can pretty much ignore guarding within models. So let's take a look at how this works. So let's go ahead and just bring this back to the example we saw before with the title. So just passing in a hard-coded title. Hopefully that makes sense. We'll get rid of this validation here, of course, because we're not actually sending a real request through. And we'll go back to the point where we see this error. So how do we usually get rid of this? Well, let's go over to our post model. And what we would normally do is add this in a fillable array directly within here. Now, this gets a little bit annoying. And if you're working on a project and you are changing models a lot and you're adding columns, you have to remember to come over to Fillable and add these in. Now, what I typically do on almost every single project is I either set guarded, so I ignore Fillable completely, to false, or I'll set guarded to the ID because that's one thing that we don't want to manually fill in. But typically I would just set this to false like so. What setting guarded to false will do is just completely unguard this particular model. So now if we go over to the browser and give that a refresh, you can see, sure enough, that does work. Now, it's not working at the moment because we're not filling in a user ID. We'll ignore that for now. But if we were to create this via a user, it would work. So let's actually set this up. So we're creating this via a user, and in fact, we'll fill in the user ID manually. I wouldn't normally do that, but let's go ahead and just do that for now to demonstrate that this does actually work. And you can see that's been filled in there. Okay, so this is okay. but there's a much better way. And this is what I mean. When you start a Laravel project, you just want one simple command to unguard everything so you can just get on with creating models and filling your database with data. So I'm going to get rid of guarded false from here. We're going to come over to our app service provider, or you could create a specific service provider for this. We're going to reference the model from Database and Eloquent, and we're going to say unguard. That is it. That is one thing that I would add to every new Laravel project. So by doing this, this will take every single model you have created and every single model you're going to create in the future, and it will do exactly what we just did over in that post model by setting guarded to false. So now if we head back over to web and we create another one here, you can see, sure enough, it just works. So this is a controversial one because you have to make sure that when you are accepting user input, first of all, you're validating it. And you also need to make sure that when you're creating this out using request data, you're not doing something like request and all. That is a very bad idea. It means that any data can be posted through to your forms and it can be inserted directly into your database. So that is the first thing that I would do in every new Laravel project. I would go ahead and unguard all models. Now, with most of the things that we're going to discuss, we have the ability to set a state. So what you can do is you can change this around per environment. Now, for unguarding, it doesn't really make sense to do this, but what you can do is do something like is production or is not production. So you can go ahead and control whether this actually gets set or not. Okay, so we've looked at model unguarding. The next thing that we're going to take a look at also relates to models, and this is model should be strict. So we use exactly the same thing. Model should be strict. Once again, we can pass into here whether it should be strict or not based on some sort of condition. So for example, you could add this only in production or whether it's not in production. So let's go over here and say not app is production. We'll talk about why we would do this in a minute when we go through each of the methods that should be strict actually calls. So let's take a look at this. Let's open the should be strict method over here on the model. And you can see that this does three things. So it calls three different methods within here, which you can use individually. So if you wanted to chop and change out what you did enable and what you didn't enable, you can go ahead and do this. So we're going to go through each one of these because it's really important that we actually understand when we call a method what this is actually doing. So the first one is preventing lazy loading. So what is preventing lazy loading? And again, you could call this specifically if you wanted to, just to do that on its own, but we're using this as part of should be strict. So let's take a look at preventing lazy loading. So let's get rid of the example that we have over here. Now we saw from earlier over on this post, we have this relationship to the user. So we've got a couple of posts in the database. I'm going to go ahead and rename this to post 2. And what we're going to do is we're going to fetch all of the posts. So let's grab each of our posts here and we'll say post and we'll just say get. We don't really care what we're doing. Let's go ahead and create out a view really quickly. So let's make out a view here called posts and let's go ahead and render that posts view and let's pass down those posts. Now what we're going to do inside of this post view is iterate over each of the posts. So let's say for each post as post, and we're going to go ahead and in here probably as part of our application output our post title, but then we want to say who this post is by. So we would access the user, then we would access the name. So we're accessing that relationship directly through the post. Now over in app service provider, I'm just going to go ahead and comment out should be strict, and let's go over to our app and see what we get here. So we've got post 1 by Alex, post 2 by Alex. Now what is actually happening behind the scenes here is we are executing an n+1 query, because for every post we are then performing a query to fetch the user of this post. We can demonstrate this by just coming over and requiring in something like Laravel debug bar on our development environment. And if we just open this up back in the browser, once this is finished, we should see our query list in here. And you can see we've got 2 duplicate queries for every single post. And if we create another post, we would have another duplicated query. Now, the command that we just uncommented here should be strict. So let's just uncomment that here. prevent lazy loading will do exactly what it says. It will prevent us from lazy loading data, which is exactly what we've done over here when we've gone ahead and lazily fetched the user out. We've not specifically loaded this up front. Let's go over to the browser now and give this a refresh, and now we get an error. Now, the reason that we chose not to have strict models on production is because in a production environment, you would rather see extra queries than receive an error. You don't want your users to have an error if you have forgotten to eager load something, so it's best to disable this in production. And you can change that around if you really want to. That's just the way that I would do it. So you can see here we've got an exception thrown, a lazy loading violation exception thrown, and it says exactly what we need to do. So we need to go over to our web root or our controller, wherever we do this, and we now know that we have forgotten to eager load this, so we can specifically go ahead and eager load in the user. Sure enough, when we come back over to the browser, this has been fixed. We don't have any duplicate queries. This has done a where lookup for all of the potential users that we would see within this list, and behind the scenes, Eloquent has pieced it together. Okay, great. So that is what the first thing does. And once again, you can use this in isolation if you want to. So we've looked at preventing lazy loading. What about prevent silently discarding attributes? What on earth does this do? Well, to demonstrate this, we're going to go ahead and cancel off the model unguard that we've already used. And let's go ahead and fetch a post out of the database and go ahead and update it. So let's say post find one, and let's go ahead and do something to update this. So I'm going to go ahead and say fill. So, or I could either set the attribute or I could use fill here. And I'm going to say user ID 2. Then I'm going to go ahead and save this out. Now, if we head back over to our post model, if we had guarded enabled or disabled here, so if we'd set guarded to false, this would go ahead and work because we'd be allowed to set this user ID. But if we are using fillable fields and we have, say, just the title set and not the user ID, we know that this fill is going to fail. Now, I'm going to just go over to the browser and give this a refresh, and you can see that this actually looked like it worked, although it didn't update it in the database. Now, what has happened here is it silently discarded, as the method name that we are now using implies, the attribute that couldn't be filled. Now, if we head back over to App Service Provider and enable this, it's going to let us know that we can't fill in that user ID. Now, you may, if you've been working with Laravel for a while, been attempting at some point to update a property on a model, and you've wondered why it's not updating. Why is this user ID not being set here? And it almost looks like it's working in the browser, but it's not behind the scenes. This command will help you out, figure out straight away that this is the reason why. So it's a really useful method just to save yourself a bit of time. Okay, so now you can see that hasn't been updated in the database because we've seen that error. Let's look at the last one of our strict models, and then we'll move on. So let's head back over to our app service provider. Let's go ahead and unguard everything, and let's go over to should be strict. This last one is pretty straightforward. Prevent accessing missing attributes. Now, this again will save you a lot of time if you make a spelling mistake somewhere, or you're trying to access an attribute of a model that you think exists but actually doesn't. So let's leave should be strict on, and let's go over to our web just here. Let's try and access something on this post that just doesn't exist. So let's echo out, and well, let's say post ABC. Let's head over to the browser, and there we go. So we've got the attribute ABC either does not exist or was not retrieved for the model. That could be for any reason it's not being returned, but you can see that that now goes ahead and fails. Now, if we didn't have that turned on, we would just get a null output. So this either wouldn't be output in a template, or you would just not see the result in the browser or your API if you're building one. So there we go. Again, super helpful for when you're spending a long time trying to figure out why something is not being output, when in actual fact it could be that you have just gone ahead and misspelled something. And that's the most common reason for not seeing a value being output. You've just spelled something wrong. The next thing we're going to talk about is Carbon's immutable date functionality, and changing this to save ourselves huge headaches when we're working with dates and times. Now, let's go ahead and not quite enable this or disable this just yet. We'll go ahead and look at an example of the problem that we have here and how we can address this. So to change this, we're going to go over and use the date facade within Laravel, and we're going to say use carbon immutable, and that comes from the carbon package, which is included with Laravel. Now I'm going to go ahead and comment this out for now while I demonstrate this. Let's come over to our web roots and see what the problem is. Now, by default, any dates that we work with within Carbon are mutable by default. So let's go ahead and demonstrate this. I'm going to use now, which returns to us a Carbon instance. Let's just die dump on now or on the date, and let's give this a refresh. And you can see we get a Carbon object back. This is showing as part of Laravel's support here, but behind the scenes, this is actually the Carbon PHP package. Okay, so what happens when we add a couple of hours to this date? So we've got an original date here, and we're going to say, let's say future, and we'll say date, add hours to. Now, really, ideally, what we would expect here is this is the current date and time, and this is the current date and time add 2 hours. But what has actually happened here is because carbon is mutable by default, this future date will be 2 hours in the future, but this will have changed the date that we originally had set. So to demonstrate this, let's say to date times string, and let's also dump the future, and we'll say to date times string as well. So let's go over to the browser and give that a refresh. You can see that both of these dates are now the same. So what has happened is, and this can get really confusing when you're working with dates, particularly with things like booking systems, is we have a reference to the current date and time, which we kind of expect to stay at the current date and time, but we also now have this future. Now, there's a couple of ways to get around this, and that is the first way is to use the copy method within Carbon. So this will create a immutable copy of the original date that we're referencing. So it will create a new instance of it. And then when you use something like add hours, it will only deal with that instance. So that solves the problem. You can see I'm recording at 11:52 here. That's the current date and time. And of course, in 2 hours, it's 1:52. So that is one solution. But do you want to rely on always copying these values within your code? It's very unlikely that you're ever going to want to mutate an original value like this. So we've already seen how to solve this, and that is by going ahead and using date, use carbon immutable, and that will work with this by default. So let's make sure we go ahead and don't copy this. So we just don't want to think about having to do that at all. Let's go over and give that a refresh, and there we go. You can see the difference without having to manually use copy. So this is a tricky one because you don't necessarily need to add this to your project unless you are working a lot with dates and times. But if you are, this is a really, really useful one. Okay, so the last thing that I would add to every single Laravel project is prohibiting destructive database commands, specifically in production. How do we do this? Well, we use the DB facade. So let's go ahead and reference that within our app service provider. And let's say prohibit destructive commands. And we're not going to do this when the app is, or we are going to do this, sorry, only when the app is in production. So what does this do? Well, let's go ahead and just comment this out for now, and we'll just talk about what the commands here do. So we have a set of destructive commands that when we run in production could cause data to be lost. That is things like PHP artisan and DB wipe. And we also have things like migrate and rollback. We have migrate reset. All of these things can potentially cause data loss. You do not want to be rolling back migrations in production, because if you have created a column in production using a migration, when you migrate the database, that has been filled with data, perhaps from your users or some other process. When you go ahead and roll this back, that's going to go ahead and remove them columns and basically get rid of the data. So ideally, you never want to run any of these production or these commands in production. Now, Laravel does have safeguards for this. So I'm just going to go over to the app env and I'm going to set the app env to production here. Let's go over and run PHP artisan and let's say db wipe, so a really destructive command. You'll notice that what this will do is it will warn us first, and it will say, are you sure you want to run this command? And by default, we have no selected. So we can just hit enter, command cancelled. But if you really want to safeguard things, it's a good idea to prohibit destructive commands entirely. Let's look at the difference that this makes, and it will be exactly the same thing for migrate rollback, migrate reset, all of that kind of stuff. So I'm going to run db wipe again now that prohibit destructive commands is enabled. And there we go. We don't even get the option to go ahead and run this. This command is prohibited from running in this environment. So that is one I would add specifically for production to stop anyone, including ourselves, running any of the destructive commands here. And of course, you can go ahead and see which destructive commands this applies to as well. So if you wanted to go over to this, you can see exactly which commands each of these relate to. And very recently, rollback was added in Laravel 11. It wasn't initially in there, but rollback has recently been added to this. Okay, there we go. There are probably more, but these are the main things that I would do in any new Laravel project, just to either help protect ourselves, speed up development in terms of any mistakes we might be making, and also stopping us from doing really silly things like not eager loading any of our relations. We've gone through each of these in quite a lot of detail, so hopefully you can pick and choose which you'd like to add to your own Laravel projects.